January 10, 1475. A frozen valley in eastern Moldavia lies under a sheet of white that will never be the same. Snow holds the shape of thousands of bodies. Men who once marched beneath banners and drums now make the land a mosaic of blood and armor. Faces turned toward a winter sky that does not care. The numbers are brutal and simple. Tens of thousands of Ottoman soldiers who began the campaign in full confidence. And by the end of a single, savage day, many of them would be gone. They had marched as if victory was an entitlement, the kind of arrogance forged by decades of conquest, the kind that believes logistics and terrain are mere inconveniences to be solved by numbers alone. Opposing them was a much smaller force, not built on grand cities or immense wealth, but on something far more dangerous to invaders: unbreakable will. Moldavia, a land of forests, frozen rivers, and stubborn families, stood because a prince decided that survival required impossible choices. His name was Stephen III, later Stephen the Great, and he understood war not through romantic ideals, but through cold, unsympathetic mathematics. He treated conflict as psychology, logistics, and the willingness to sacrifice comfort, reputation, and even his own people if it meant saving the country as a whole. This is the story of how an outnumbered army turned an empire's greatest advantages into fatal liabilities, and why that single victory matters in the larger machinery of history. Not because it ended the Ottoman advance, it did not, but because it proved a principle too many empires learn only after deep wounds. The value of conquest is always limited by the cost of achieving it. To understand how Moldavia ever reached this moment, we have to look back at what made the Ottomans the unstoppable force they were. In 1453, the world watched a fortress that had stood for more than 1,000 years collapse. Constantinople, the city people believed could never fall, was shattered by a young sultan whose ambition and firepower rewrote global power dynamics. With massive cannons, disciplined infantry, tireless cavalry, and engineering unmatched in Europe, the Ottoman war machine poured across southeast Europe like a flood. Kingdoms fell, vassals multiplied, tribute became the price of survival. By the mid-1470s, the Ottoman Empire controlled the Balkans, Anatolia, and the entire Black Sea coastline. Their army was efficient, brutal, and organized. Janissaries drilled as elite infantry from childhood. Sipahi cavalry provided speed and shock. Irregular raiders softened targets ahead of invasion. Vassal troops provided numbers even if not loyalty. Their supply chains could feed armies hundreds of miles from home. Their confidence was not arrogance, it was earned, which made them the perfect opponent for Stephen, a man who understood overconfidence as a weapon waiting to be used. Moldavia was small, surrounded by predators on every side. Ottomans to the south, Hungarians to the west, Poland to the north, and Crimean Tatars to the east. Its survival depended on precision diplomacy, paying tribute to one power, allying with another, and avoiding entanglements that would leave it exposed. Stephen took this fragile strategy and reforged it into something sharper. He studied Ottoman campaigns the way a surgeon studies anatomy. He read accounts of Kosovo, Varna, and the fall of Constantinople. He observed how Janissary formations advanced, how Ottoman cavalry maneuvered, how siege artillery was deployed, and most importantly, how their enormous armies depended on food, rest, and predictable seasons. His forces were small but not amateur. His elite household troops drilled constantly. His infantry could maneuver in tight coordination. His cavalry understood the forests, the hidden paths, the icy rivers that outsiders saw as obstacles but Moldavians saw as weapons. When Stephen stopped paying tribute and installed his own preferred ruler in nearby Wallachia, he wasn't acting impulsively. He knew precisely what reaction it would provoke. The Sultan would not tolerate defiance. Defiance demanded annihilation. So when an Ottoman army, vast, experienced, and convinced of easy victory, began massing for invasion, Stephen did something that outraged half his commanders and terrified the other half. He ordered Moldavia burned. This is the part of history people like to skip past, the moment where strategy becomes personal tragedy. Every village in the path of the Ottoman advance was to be emptied, every store of grain burned, every well poisoned, Every shelter that could warm an invading soldier destroyed. Families fled into the winter night with nothing but what they could carry. Many never made it to safety. This was not a tactic designed for glory. It was designed to break an empire's momentum by attacking its stomach, its horses, its morale. Stephen understood that while armies win battles, logistics win wars. The Ottomans marched anyway, stepping into a landscape turned hostile by design. Where they expected warm villages, they found ashes. Where they expected food, they found rot. Where they expected clean water, they found dead animals floating in poison wells. Foraging parties were hunted down. Vassal troops, already unmotivated, grew restless. Horses starved. Men froze. The incredible machine that conquered continents suddenly found itself dragging its own weight through hell. Stephen's strategy was not built on force. It was built on exhaustion, winter, hunger, fear. He didn't want a summer battle. He wanted the Ottomans starving, sleepless, half-broken before they ever saw his army. When the two forces finally met in a valley near Vaslui, a valley that looked deceptively open, deceptively inviting, the Ottomans still believed numbers would decide everything. But Stephen had engineered every step that brought them here. He knew where their cavalry would struggle, where their infantry would bunch up, where his archers could strike unseen, and where the frozen ground would break their formations. He had turned the land itself into a weapon. The valley Stephen chose was not the kind of terrain empires like to fight in. It was narrow, with forested ridges on both sides that hid movement. A frozen stream cut through the center at an angle, its surface deceptive. Solid in some places, thin enough to crack under marching weight in others. Snowdrifts concealed pits and ditches molded by rain and frost. From a distance, none of this was visible. It looked like open, simple ground. It looked like an invitation. Stephen positioned his troops on the higher northern end. Infantry lined the slopes, shields and pikes ready. Archers waited in the dark ribs of the forest. His artillery, few pieces but well-placed, pointed downhill, aimed at the exact spots the Ottomans would be forced to pass through. Behind all this, hidden in dense woods, sat Moldavia's cavalry. Disciplined, armored, and silent. The Ottomans arrived in sprawling waves that filled the valley from ridge to ridge. Even weakened by cold and hunger, they looked invincible. Janissaries in the center stood like a wall of iron. Sipahi cavalry formed proud arcs on the wings, ready to envelop whatever stood before them. Vassal troops filled the gaps, pushing through snow with stiff legs and hollow stomachs. On paper, they still had overwhelming superiority. They still believed the Moldavians would break like every other principality before them. But the battlefield favored neither numbers nor pride, only preparation. Stephen watched from his high ground. He saw how slowly the Ottoman formations moved. He saw the gaps between units widening. He saw horses stumbling on frozen patches. He saw the strain in the men's posture, the stiffness of exhaustion, the sluggishness of hunger, the dullness in their eyes. These soldiers were not arriving for battle. They were arriving after weeks of slow dying. And still they pushed forward because they had no choice. To retreat without victory meant the Sultan's wrath. To halt meant starvation. Their only hope was to smash the Moldavian line quickly and reclaim control of the campaign. The battle began with the Ottoman irregulars, the Akinji skirmishers, sent forward to test the Moldavian defenses. They charged uphill with wild screams, firing arrows to force a reaction. But the Moldavian front line held steady. When the Akinji came too close, volleys of crossbow bolts ripped into them, and arquebusiers fired their thunderous shots. Horses reared, men fell, confusion rippled through the attackers. The irregulars retreated in frustration. This was exactly what the Moldavians wanted. The Akinji were never meant to break the line, they were meant to measure it. Their failure told the Ottoman command one thing: the Moldavian vanguard was thin, could be broken if enough force was applied. So the Ottomans committed their core, the Janissaries. Thousands of disciplined, battle-forged infantry advanced up the slope in tight, organized blocks. These were the men who had broken the walls of Constantinople. Their steps were measured, their shields aligned, their resolve hardened by a lifetime of training. Snow and cold meant nothing to them. They had marched too far to be intimidated now. The Moldavian infantry fired volleys, then braced. The Janissaries slammed into their line, and the clash filled the valley with a roar. Steel beating against shields, pikes splintering under heavy blades, cries of wounded men swallowed by the winter air. For 20 brutal minutes, the Moldavian vanguard held its ground. They fought in tight formation, backing up slowly, never breaking cohesion. Then, at the exact moment Stephen had planned, they began their controlled retreat. To Ottoman eyes, it looked like victory. The Janissaries pressed harder, shouting triumphantly. Other Ottoman units surged forward to join the breakthrough. Morale lifted. The enemy was collapsing. Finally, something was going right. But this momentum was a lie. As the Ottomans pushed forward, their formations compressed into the valley's narrowest point. Men jostled for space. Units mixed. Commanders struggled to keep order. Horses slipped on frozen stream crossings. Hidden ditches swallowed boots and shattered ankles. And as the valley narrowed, the density of bodies increased, making them perfect targets. At that moment, Moldavian artillery fired. The cannons roared from the hillside, launching heavy projectiles into the clustered Ottoman ranks. In open space, these shots would scatter harmlessly. In this kill box, each blast ripped through tightly packed soldiers, tearing limbs, breaking lines, crushing morale. Men flinched, ducked, stumbled. Discipline wavered. Then the forests came alive. Moldavian archers, who had waited silently along both flanks, unleashed a storm of arrows. Volley after volley poured down on the exposed Ottoman sides. The Sipahi cavalry, trapped by thick undergrowth and steep terrain, couldn't maneuver to counter or shield themselves. Their horses panicked. Their formations crumbled before they even engaged. Stephen watched the moment the Ottoman machine began to fall apart. The Janissaries, still pushing forward up the center, now faced fire from 3 directions. Pikes in front, arrows from both sides, artillery from above. They attempted to regroup and shift formations, but in the valley's choking space, movement was impossible. Their discipline, usually their greatest weapon, now trapped them in a killing zone. Stephen turned to his cavalry commanders and gave a single order, now. The impact was explosive. Moldavian heavy cavalry burst from both forests at once, thundering into the Ottoman flanks with devastating force. War horses, armored and bred for impact, smashed into disorganized ranks. Lances pierced through shoulder plates. Ottoman soldiers, already stumbling, had no room to dodge or brace. Some were trampled instantly. Others fled instinctively, creating even more chaos. The left flank collapsed almost immediately. Wallachian vassals fighting for the Ottomans dropped their weapons and ran. They had no desire to die for an empire that had conquered their homeland. Their retreat tore open a massive gap in the Ottoman line, and Moldavian infantry surged into it, striking the Janissaries from behind. The Janissaries, the best soldiers the empire had, were now surrounded. They fought like demons, refusing to surrender. But numbers don't matter when you are attacked from every angle. Their formations broke apart under combined cavalry and infantry pressure. Groups of Janissaries formed small pockets of resistance, fighting to the last man. One by one, these pockets disappeared under Moldavian blades. On the right flank, the Sipahi cavalry attempted to regroup. But disengaging under fire is nearly impossible. Moldavian light cavalry harassed them relentlessly, preventing any organized counterattack. By the time they reached the center, the battle was already lost. Suleiman Pasha watched his army collapse before his eyes. The center was disintegrating. The flanks were gone. The killbox Stephen had engineered now devoured everything inside it. The Ottoman commander understood the grim truth. No amount of bravery could salvage this battle. He ordered a retreat. But a retreat requires discipline. What happened instead was panic. The first soldiers to run were individuals. A Janissary who had lost his shield, a vassal footman whose spear had snapped, a Sipahi whose horse slipped under him. Then a dozen broke. Then 100. Fear spreads faster than flame when an army is exhausted, starving, and suddenly confronted with the reality that the enemy they underestimated has just trapped them. Within minutes, retreat stopped being a maneuver and became a stampede. Men fled south, the same direction they had marched from, now a frozen hellscape they barely survived the first time. Officers shouted at them to hold, to regroup, to rally behind banners, but their voices were swallowed by the roar of chaos. Stephen's army, disciplined and deliberate, pressed into the panic, turning fleeing soldiers into easy targets. This was not a battle anymore. It was a hunt. Moldavian cavalry thundered after the retreating masses. Light riders circled ahead, cutting down those who attempted to escape through the forests. Heavy cavalry smashed through pockets of resistance. Infantry followed at a relentless march, finishing those wounded or trapped in the snow. The Ottomans tried to form defensive clusters here and there, but surrounded by enemies who knew the terrain and fought with righteous fury, these standstill attempts collapsed almost instantly. Some Ottoman soldiers threw down their weapons, shouting surrender in Turkish, raising their hands or falling to their knees. A few high-ranking officers were taken alive, valuable for ransom or for bargaining. But most who surrendered met no mercy. Stephen understood a truth many rulers refused to accept. Mercy today becomes an enemy tomorrow. Any soldier who made it back to the Sultan would return reinforced, better supplied, and even more determined. Mercy in this context was not compassion, it was suicide. So Moldavian troops carried out their prince's unspoken command. Fleeing men were speared in the back. Cavalry trampled the wounded. Archers continued firing volleys into collapsing formations. Screams echoed through the forested valley as the moon rose, and the snow that had begun the day white was now a collage of red and shadow. Some Ottomans tried to hide rather than flee. Men crawled under fallen branches, buried themselves in snowbanks, or climbed trees in desperation. But Moldavian scouts and peasants, hardened by years of border warfare and driven by the memory of Ottoman raids, found them. In the forests, on the hillsides, even inside overturned wagons, nowhere was safe. This pursuit lasted hours. It stretched far beyond the valley, into the surrounding woods and meadows, into the icy paths leading south. By dawn on January 11th, the full horror of the previous night became visible. The Valley of Vaslui was a graveyard. Bodies lay in piles, scattered across fields, slumped against trees. Some had died from wounds, others from cold where they collapsed. Horses lay frozen mid-fall. Shattered armor and broken weapons littered the ground. Blood had soaked deep into the snow and refrozen into jagged crimson patches. The morning light revealed a scene so brutal that even experienced Moldavian soldiers stared in silence. No one could count the dead accurately, but the estimates were staggering. Between 40,000 and 45,000 Ottomans had been killed, a number almost unthinkable for a single day of medieval warfare. Others had escaped only to die in the frozen wilderness during the retreat. Moldavian losses were far fewer, between 5,000 and 10,000, but for a small principality, even that was a devastating blow. This was one of the worst defeats the Ottoman military had ever suffered. Janissary units were gutted. Sipahi contingents were crippled. Vassal troops were scattered or dead. Artillery and baggage trains were captured. The Ottoman prestige, built over decades of victories, had cracked in one catastrophic, freezing day. Yet victory did not bring Stephen joy. Standing in the ruin of the battlefield, surrounded by his commanders, he did not celebrate. He knew what his people had paid to achieve this win. Moldavian villages had been burned by their own hands. Civilians had frozen during evacuations. Families returning home would find nothing but ashes. This was not triumph. This was survival bought with irreversible loss. Still, news of the victory swept across Europe like wildfire. In Hungary, in Poland, in the Italian states, messengers arrived breathless with the unbelievable report. A small principality had crushed an Ottoman army 3 times its size. Chroniclers copied the story across parchment. Envoys carried letters of praise. Even skeptics could not ignore the numbers. The Ottoman Empire, the same force that had taken Constantinople, had been humbled. In Rome, Pope Sixtus IV received the report with disbelief. He read it twice, certain the translator had exaggerated. When later confirmations arrived, the Pope issued a proclamation naming Stephen Athleta Christi, Champion of Christ, a title reserved for defenders of Christendom. Churches across Catholic Europe held services in Stephen's honor. Artists began sketching him as a warrior saint. Politicians invoked his name as proof that the Ottoman tide could be resisted. Across the continent, morale rose. For decades, Christian states had been paralyzed by fear, convinced that no army could stand against Ottoman power. The fall of Constantinople, the collapse of Serbia, the subjugation of Bosnia, all these events had ground European confidence into dust. But Vaslui cracked that fear. If Moldavia could do it, perhaps others could too. Yet while Europe celebrated, Stephen stood face to face with the harsh reality of what came next. He knew, better than any cheering king or triumphant cardinal, that the war was far from over. The Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople, was still alive. And he was not a man who let humiliation pass unanswered. A defeat this large was not merely a military failure. It was an insult to the Sultan's honor, his reputation, his divine mandate. Stephen knew exactly what was coming next. Not a raid, not retaliation, not punishment, annihilation. Stephen had won the battle, but the war was about to become far worse. He began preparing immediately. The victory had cost Moldavia dearly. Villages lay in ruin. Civilians were scattered. Resources depleted. But the next blow would be even greater. Mehmed would not send a general this time. He would come himself. The Sultan was already assembling a colossal army. Larger than anything Stephen had ever imagined. Larger than anything Europe had seen from the Ottomans in decades. An army not designed for conquest or tribute, but for erasure. This time, the empire was coming to destroy Moldavia completely. Across the empire, the preparations began. Orders spread from Constantinople into every province. Messages stamped with the seal of Mehmed II, the conqueror, demanded troops, supplies, siege engines, engineers, and provisions. The humiliation at Vaslui had not merely wounded Ottoman pride. It had threatened the very aura of invincibility that kept vassal states obedient and kept European kingdoms fearful. Mehmed understood power better than most rulers of his age. He knew an empire does not survive by tolerating defiance. If Moldavia was not punished absolutely, others would follow its example. By the summer of 1476, Mehmed had assembled one of the largest Ottoman armies ever deployed into Europe. Estimates vary from chronicler to chronicler, but most agree. Between 150,000 and 200,000 men marched under the Sultan's banner. This was not a punitive force. This was the full weight of an empire preparing to crush a principality that had dared embarrass it. Janissaries in massive numbers. Sipahi cavalry from across Rumelia and Anatolia. Vassal troops from Bulgaria, Serbia, Wallachia. Auxiliary forces, irregulars, raiders. A siege train capable of leveling fortresses. Engineers who had learned their craft at Constantinople. The Sultan himself leading them, wrapped in a mantle of fury and purpose. Their orders were simple: burn Moldavia, kill its men, enslave its people, level its fortresses, erase the principality. Stephen, watching the smoke of the early Ottoman advance rising in the distance, understood that this army could not be beaten in a single decisive battle. The victory at Vaslui had depended on winter, terrain, starvation, miscalculation. Mehmed was not marching in winter. He was coming in the fullness of summer, with supply lines secure and morale high. There would be no exhaustion to exploit, no easy ambushes, no starving horses stumbling through snow. So Stephen changed the rules. He once again ordered widespread evacuations. Villages that had survived 1475 were emptied again. Those rebuilt in the months after Vaslui were abandoned and torched. Families fled to fortified towns or north into Polish territory. For the second time in 2 years, Moldavian peasants packed their belongings and left everything they knew behind. Some wept as they watched their homes burn. Others were too numb to feel anything at all. The scorched earth policy continued, but now Moldavia had even less left to burn. Fields that should have been flourishing under the summer sun were instead cut down prematurely or set ablaze. Forests were stripped for resources and then fired. Wells were filled with carcasses or collapsed. If Mehmed wanted Moldavia, he would inherit a wasteland. Not a prize, not a jewel, not a province worth keeping. The Sultan's forces poured across the borders like a black tide. Villages that Moldavians abandoned were destroyed anyway. Ottoman soldiers tore down the ruins of homes, smashed the foundations, killed livestock left behind, and enslaved any civilians who failed to flee in time. Vengeance burned through every action. Moldavian lands that had faced destruction once now faced it twice. Stephen's main army refused to stand and fight. Instead, he waged a campaign of attrition and harassment. His cavalry raided Ottoman supply convoys with hit-and-run tactics. Bridges were burned, forcing the massive invading army to slow its pace. Wells were poisoned before the Ottomans reached them. Raiders attacked foraging parties, killing a few men at a time, then vanishing before retaliation. These strikes were pinpricks against an empire, but even pinpricks matter when the beast is bleeding from thousands of tiny cuts. Still, Stephen knew attrition alone couldn't stop Mehmed. The Ottoman army kept advancing, slower than it liked, but unstoppable. Cut across southern Moldavia like a plague. Smoke rose from dozens of villages each day. Refugees poured northward. The Moldavian countryside became a corridor of ashes. By late July 1476, Mehmed reached his true objective. Suceava, Stephen's capital and strongest fortress. Built on high ground, fortified with thick stone walls, and stocked with supplies, Suceava was the heart of Moldavia's defensive network. If the Ottomans took it, Moldavia would collapse. Mehmed ordered the siege to begin. Ottoman artillery opened fire, pounding the walls daily. Engineers dug trenches and prepared scaling towers. The Janissaries, veterans of dozens of sieges, prepared for repeated assaults. Suceava's defenders, hardened soldiers who had fought at Vaslui, stood ready. They knew that surrender meant death or slavery. They'd seen what the Ottomans did to towns that resisted. For 3 weeks, the siege dragged on. Stone cracked and split under cannon fire. Sections of the walls collapsed. Janissary assault teams poured into breaches, only to be driven back by Moldavian defenders who fought with desperation and fury. Flaming arrows lit the siege works at night. Defenders hurled rocks, boiling water, and tar. The fortress became a furnace, burning men from both sides. Meanwhile, outside the walls, Stephen remained elusive. He refused to commit to a relief battle. He knew that if he brought his 40,000 depleted men into direct combat with Mehmed's enormous host, Moldavia would be wiped out. So he stuck to the shadows, continuing to harass Ottoman supply lines. Caravans disappeared. Scouts vanished. Diseases spread through the Ottoman camp. Dysentery, typhus, fevers. Silent killers unleashed by poor sanitation and weeks of siege conditions. The longer the siege went on, the more Mehmed's army began to suffer. Food ran low. Horses weakened. Morale cracked. Letters arrived from distant provinces reporting unrest. Vassal princes grew uncertain. Rumors spread that European states were regrouping. The Sultan had promised a fast, decisive victory, but Moldavia refused to die. By mid-August, Mehmed faced the same dilemma Suleiman Pasha had encountered before Vaslui. Continue the siege and watch his army rot, or retreat and preserve what remained of his forces. But unlike Suleiman, Mehmed had a reputation strong enough to survive a withdrawal if he left Moldavia in ruins. The Sultan gave the order: lift the siege, burn everything, begin the march south. Before leaving, his army unleashed a wave of destruction across southern Moldavia. Every building still standing was torched. Fields were salted. Wells filled with corpses. Villages were emptied and flattened. What Moldavia had lost in 1475 was horrific. What it lost in 1476 was apocalyptic. Stephen watched the Ottoman army retreat. There was no celebration, no cheers, no joy. He had survived, but half his country was gone. Stephen understood what few rulers ever fully grasp. Victory and survival are not the same thing. Moldavia still existed, barely, but the cost was written across the land in blackened soil and abandoned homes. The villages burned in 1475 had been rebuilt by hand, brick by brick, only to be burned again in 1476. Families who had once fled north with whatever possessions they could carry came back to find nothing left. Many didn't return at all. The Moldavian countryside, once dotted with farms and orchards, now looked like a wound carved across the earth. Yet, astonishingly, Moldavia was still independent. Stephen had held the line where so many other princes had fallen. But that survival had come at a human price no chronicler could truly capture. It would take years, decades, for Moldavia to recover from the devastation inflicted by the Sultan's revenge campaign. Stephen now faced a new task: reconstruction. Princes, after all, do not have the luxury of resting after war. They rebuild. Stephen ordered the reconstruction of villages. What remained of the Moldavian treasury went to helping displaced families return home. Fields were replanted, roads repaired, wells cleared and restored. Wooden homes rose again, though many families chose not to return to their original lands, instead settling wherever safety seemed greatest. Entire regions remained empty, their previous inhabitants displaced forever. But while Moldavia struggled back toward life, Europe could not stop talking about the Battle of Vaslui. From Italy to Poland, from Hungary to the German principalities, Stephen's name became a rallying cry. Chroniclers and diplomats described him as a warrior blessed by God, a defender of Christianity, a symbol of hope against an empire that for decades had appeared unstoppable. The papal curia praised him in letters. Kings referenced him in negotiations. His reputation soared so dramatically that many Western Europeans spoke of him in the same breath as ancient heroes. Let the truth be clear. This glorification was convenient. European states desperately needed a hero. The fall of Constantinople had broken morale. Hungary was under immense pressure. Wallachia and Serbia had been vassalized. Bosnia had fallen. The Ottomans had advanced across the Balkans with relentless momentum. Europe was fractured, plagued by internal rivalries, unable to unite. So when Moldavia, a principality barely acknowledged at major courts, shattered an Ottoman army 3 times its size, it was not just a military event. It was psychological salvation. Still, the battlefield glory celebrated in distant courts ignored the tragedies etched into Moldavian soil. The survivors carried wounds deeper than victory speeches could convey. And Stephen, despite being hailed as a champion of Christendom, felt the weight of what his decisions had cost. He had saved his people, yes, but many had died in the process. Many more had lost everything. Leadership in these moments is not triumph, it is burden. Over the next decades, Stephen remained as relentless as ever. His life did not return to peace. Moldavia's survival demanded constant vigilance. The borderland was a dangerous place. Threats were ever present. Alliances shifted like sand. Once the Ottomans withdrew in 1476, Stephen had no illusions that the danger had passed. He kept drilling his army. He strengthened fortresses. He negotiated shrewd alliances. He fought border skirmishes with Tatars and Hungarians. He even defeated a Polish invasion in 1497 at the Battle of the Kosman Forest. Over 47 years on the throne, Stephen fought more than 40 battles and lost only 2. This record was not luck. It was the product of obsessive preparation and an unyielding understanding of geopolitics. Stephen realized that Moldavia's existence depended on making itself too costly to conquer. The Ottomans were vast, wealthy, and powerful, but even an empire has limits. If Moldavia remained a thorn that always bled its conquerors, then the empire would turn its attention to easier targets. This is why Vaslui remains so important. The battle did not destroy the Ottoman Empire. It did not save Europe, It did not end the threat. What it did, and this is essential, was buy time. Time is the most undervalued commodity in history. Vaslui bought years during which Hungary, Poland, and Moldavia could prepare defenses. It created a window where alliances could be formed, fortresses built, weapons forged. It also shattered the psychological illusion of Ottoman invincibility, an illusion that had frozen European resistance. Stephen's victory exposed Ottoman vulnerabilities, overextended supply lines in hostile terrain, dependence on vassal troops who might break under pressure, difficulty coordinating massive armies in winter conditions, the danger of fighting on restrictive terrain, the toll hunger, exhaustion, and attrition take on morale. These were not new discoveries, but Stephen proved they could be weaponized decisively. Military tacticians across Europe studied Vaslui for generations. Hungarian commanders examined it when preparing their own wars against the Ottomans. Polish leaders referenced its lessons. Even Austrian officers in the late 17th century, during the Siege of Vienna, revisited Stephen's strategies to understand how to resist imperial expansion. But beyond the tactical implications, Vaslui delivered a far deeper message. Empires can bleed. Empires can falter. Empires can be resisted. And resistance is never futile when the cost inflicted becomes too great. Still, Stephen knew the danger had not passed. Moldavia remained a small principality caught between powerful rivals. The Ottomans would return, not with vengeance but with strategy. Indeed, in 1484 the Ottomans captured important Moldavian fortresses along the Black Sea coast, weakening Moldavia's strategic position. A generation later, the region would again be engulfed in conflict. Vaslui had not defeated the empire. It had simply delayed it. The Ottoman machine would continue to expand, conquering vast territories for another century and more. It would besiege Vienna twice. It would dominate the Balkans for centuries. But Stephen's victory gave his people something precious: survival. For nearly 5 decades of rule, Stephen defended Moldavia from external threats with ferocity and cunning. When he died in 1504 at the age of 71, an extraordinary age for a medieval warrior prince, Moldavia remained independent. That alone was an achievement unmatched by most rulers of his era. Centuries later, his legacy would be claimed by multiple modern nations. Romania regards him as a founding father. Moldova honors him as a national hero. Ukraine, too, preserves fragments of his fortified legacy. His memory stretched across borders he never lived to see because his influence extended beyond mere territorial rule. Yet behind all the statues, behind the sainthood bestowed by the Romanian Orthodox Church, behind the legends and the songs, lies the truth. Stephen saved Moldavia by choosing the terrible option. He chose suffering now to prevent annihilation later. He chose to burn his own land so that it would not be taken. He chose to sacrifice what was recoverable to preserve what was not: freedom. History rarely honors the people who paid the price: the nameless peasants who evacuated twice, the families who buried loved ones in the snow, the soldiers who died in forests far from their homes. Vaslui was Stephen's masterpiece, but it was built on the backs of thousands who never received recognition. And yet, without them, without their endurance, without their willingness to follow a prince who asked them to destroy their own world, Moldavia would have vanished like so many other states crushed by empires. Their suffering made survival possible. The chronicles that recorded Stephen's triumphs rarely recorded the cost. They listed the battles, the strategies, the alliances, but they did not list the names of the peasants who froze during winter evacuations, or the families who returned to find only charred beams where their homes once stood. History remembers victories, not the grief stored quietly in the shadows behind them. Yet Stephen knew that grief intimately. Every decision he made was sharpened by the knowledge that Moldavia's survival demanded constant sacrifice. The victory at Vaslui had bought time, but time demanded payment. The Ottomans returned again and again throughout his reign, sometimes with armies large enough to level cities, sometimes with raids that tore through border villages. Stephen fought them all, not because he believed he could destroy the empire, but because he refused to let Moldavia be erased. After 1476, Moldavia's landscape was scarred permanently. Entire districts were depopulated. Farmers who once tended fertile fields now wandered as refugees or resettled in unfamiliar lands. Even years later, travelers wrote of ghost villages. Places where chimneys stood but no smoke rose, where barns leaned at broken angles, where orchards grew wild because no hands remained to prune them. Stephen carried this weight into every decision he made afterward. He rebuilt fortresses with a zeal unmatched by most rulers. He restored Suceava's defenses, strengthened other citadels like Niemt and Houghton, and constructed new outposts along vulnerable borders. Moldavia was not large, but Stephen made sure it was difficult to invade. Every stronghold that rose from the ashes of Ottoman destruction became a message. We are still here. He reformed taxation to support the army, often angering nobles who preferred spending on comfort rather than defense. He clashed with the boyars, the aristocracy who saw Moldavia as theirs to influence and manipulate. Stephen would not be manipulated. He would not allow complacency. His authority came not from birthright but from necessity. Every time he enforced harsh measures, nobles grumbled. Yet every time Moldavia survived another invasion, they silently thanked him. For Stephen, there was no room for softness. Moldavia's enemies exploited weakness. The Tatars raided from the east. The Hungarians maneuvered politically and militarily from the west. The Poles shifted alliances depending on convenience. Wallachia remained unstable, always vulnerable to Ottoman influence. The Crimean Khanate expanded its reach. Every border held a potential enemy. So Stephen prepared for war constantly, even during peace. His army drilled relentlessly. His cavalry trained in forests and river valleys, mastering maneuvers that had proven decisive at Vaslui. His infantry practiced coordinated formations, learning to fight with discipline rather than relying solely on numbers or brute strength. He stockpiled weapons, arrows, and gunpowder. He ensured Moldavia had enough provisions stored for emergencies. He learned from the Ottomans, not their arrogance but their efficiency. Stephen's reign of nearly half a century became a cycle of battle, reconstruction, diplomacy, and preparation. Survival was not a moment, it was a lifestyle. But what made Stephen remarkable was not merely his military skill. It was his political understanding of empires. He knew that Moldavia could not defeat the Ottomans permanently. He knew the empire would continue expanding. He knew the wars would never truly end. He accepted that the only realistic goal was to make Moldavia a costly, frustrating, infuriating target. If conquest becomes expensive enough, even empires look elsewhere. This was the lesson of Vaslui, and Stephen lived by it. His diplomatic maneuvers reflected this philosophy. He maintained alliances with Poland when necessary, even when relations grew tense. He supported Hungarian efforts to resist Ottoman expansion. He negotiated with the papacy for support, though the distance made meaningful aid difficult. He even used temporary understandings with the Tatars or Wallachians when it suited Moldavia's survival. Stephen was not bound by sentiment, only by strategy. Despite the destruction wrought by the 1476 campaign, Moldavia slowly recovered. New generations grew to adulthood, never knowing the full horror of the Ottoman revenge march. Fields were replanted, villages rebuilt, livestock replenished, life endured, and then, as always, war returned. In 1484, the Ottomans struck again and captured Chilia and Citadia Alba, two critical Moldavian fortresses along the Black Sea. These losses crippled Moldavia's access to trade routes and weakened its strategic position. The defeat was painful, but Stephen adapted. He shifted defensive focus inland, reinforced other strongholds, and reorganized supply networks. He never allowed a single loss to become the end. Stephen continued to win battles throughout the 1480s. His victories at Skaya, at Harlau, and at other frontier clashes proved his tactical brilliance had not dimmed with age. Even in his 60s, he rode with his troops, directing maneuvers personally. Soldiers trusted him not because he was prince, but because he was present, because he bled with them, because he demanded nothing from them that he would not demand from himself. In 1497, when the Polish king John Albert invaded Moldavia after a diplomatic fallout, Stephen faced yet another existential crisis. His former ally marched against him with a large army, believing Moldavia vulnerable after decades of war. Stephen met the invaders in the forests of Kosman. There, in terrain similar to Vaslui, he orchestrated another devastating ambush. Trees, hills, and narrow passages became weapons once more. The Polish army suffered terrible losses, and Stephen secured one of his most brilliant victories. Not against the Ottomans, but against a Christian kingdom that underestimated him. It was a reminder to all Moldavia's survival depended on resisting every aggressor, not just the empire to the south. Through all this, Stephen aged. His beard grew white. His face wore the lines of stress and unending responsibility. But his will stayed ironclad. He refused to rest. He refused to ease his vigilance. He refused to accept defeat. Because he knew something most rulers never understand until it is too late. The moment you relax is the moment your enemy decides you are conquerable. Stephen reigned for an astonishing 47 years. When he died in 1504, at the age of 71, he was one of the oldest rulers in Eastern Europe, not because he lived a peaceful life, but because he lived a purposeful one. His people mourned him not with the grief reserved for kings, but with the sorrow given to defenders, those who carried the world on their shoulders so others didn't have to. He was buried at Putna Monastery, a place he had built as a spiritual and national center. Pilgrims still come there centuries later. But legends rarely tell the full truth. Stephen was not simply a hero. He was not a saint carved from marble. He was a leader who made decisions that cost thousands of his own people their homes, their safety, and their lives. He was ruthless when necessary, gentle when possible, wise when circumstances allowed, and terrifying when survival demanded it. And he was right. Moldavia survived. Where Serbia fell, where Bosnia was taken, where Wallachia bent under the Ottoman yoke, Moldavia endured. Not untouched, not unscarred, but unbroken, Stephen had done what seemed impossible. What Stephen achieved was not merely military success. It was the preservation of a state in an era that devoured small nations. But survival carried weight, and he bore that weight until his final days. The chronicles praise his victories, his fortresses, his cunning. They rarely mention the hidden costs that outlived him. The villages that never recovered, the families who vanished from the record, the cultural wounds carved by 2 cycles of destruction only a year apart. And yet, despite the devastation, Moldavia emerged from Stephen's reign with its identity intact. In the centuries that followed, rulers, monks, scholars, and common people alike would revere his memory. They called him Defender of the Faith, Protector of the Land, Stephen the Great. But such titles only tell one side of the story, the triumphs. They do not reveal the sleepless nights, the impossible choices, the cold reasoning required to hold off an empire. The truth is more complicated. Stephen was great not because he won, but because he refused to lose. His story became the blueprint for leadership in a small state surrounded by giants. He understood the long game. Empires thrive on momentum. They conquer one region, absorb it, reorganize it, and move to the next. To resist an empire, one must disrupt that momentum. Slow it, bleed it, make the costs outweigh the benefits. This is what Vaslui accomplished. Not the end of the Ottomans, but the end of their illusion of inevitable conquest in the north. Created hesitation, doubt, caution. These things slow empires more effectively than armies can. But while we examine the strategy, the tactical genius, the geopolitical implications, we cannot lose sight of the human stories beneath them. Consider the Moldavian peasant family living in a small wooden home on the edge of a forest in 1474. They lived quietly, farming flax and wheat, raising sheep, tending orchards. Their world was simple, bounded by rivers, seasons, and the church bells that marked time. Then Stephen's scorched earth order arrived. The family packed what they could, blankets, seeds, a few tools, and fled into the cold. Their youngest child did not survive the journey. When they returned months later, the home they had built with their own hands was a pile of ash. They rebuilt with what little strength remained. A year later, Mem's army approached, and they fled again. The second time, they did not return. Their story never made it into any chronicle, but their sacrifice is what made Vaslui and Moldavia's survival possible. History glorifies kings, generals, and moments of victory. It often forgets the quiet tragedies that form the foundation of those victories. Another example, a Moldavian soldier who fought at Vaslui. He survived the brutal combat but was struck by an arrow during the pursuit. Infection took his arm. Unable to farm or hold a weapon, he spent the rest of his life begging outside a monastery. People walked past him, praising the battle that had left him crippled. Or the Ottoman Janissary who died in the snow, taken from his Christian family as a child, raised to be a soldier for the empire that stole him. He died fighting people who shared his ancestors' faith, but not his identity. His family never knew his fate. Or the Wallachian vassal soldier forced to march with the Ottomans against fellow Christians. When he fled the battlefield at Vaslui, hoping to find safety, he returned home only to be executed by Ottoman authorities for cowardice. These lives remind us that the cost of survival is never paid by rulers alone. It is paid by everyone who stands in the shadows of their decisions. Stephen understood this deeply. He prayed often. He endowed monasteries, not because he sought forgiveness from history, but because he sought forgiveness from God. Leading a small nation against an empire meant doing terrible things for the right reasons. It meant carrying sins others did not have to bear. As Moldavia rebuilt in the decades after Vaslui, its identity hardened. The Moldavians became known as a people who would not bend easily. Travelers noted their stubbornness, their pride, their fierce loyalty to their land. Stephen's reign forged this character. Hardship became a teacher. Loss became a memory carved into the earth itself. And the Ottomans? They did not forget Vaslui. How could they? 40,000 men, elite troops included, had perished in one catastrophic moment. Commanders who had once spoken confidently of northern campaigns now approached the region with caution. The empire still expanded, still conquered, still dominated, but Moldavia remained a persistent thorn. Even Mehmed, the conqueror, had been forced to withdraw from Moldavia without achieving his ultimate goal. His 1476 campaign destroyed much of the principality but did not break it. And for a ruler who had taken Constantinople, failing to crush a small state was a humiliation he carried until his death 5 years later. In the centuries that followed, Ottoman chronicles, usually triumphant, spoke of Vaslui with unease. They described it as a disaster, a night of terror, a catastrophic reversal. Rumors persisted that some Janissary units refused to speak of the battle at all. The memory lingered like a scar. This psychological impact mattered. Empires expand not only through force but also through the belief that they cannot be stopped. Vaslui disrupted that belief. It proved that the empire could bleed, could miscalculate, could be defeated under the right conditions. Stephen's victory echoed far beyond his lifetime. His successors inherited a Moldavia still vulnerable but fiercely proud. They inherited fortresses rebuilt from ruins, soldiers trained in his methods, and a political philosophy built on balancing threats rather than defeating them outright. Even after the principality eventually fell under Ottoman influence in later centuries, the memory of Stephen's resistance became a pillar of national identity. In modern times, both Romania and Moldova claim Stephen as a foundational figure. He appears on banknotes, in textbooks, in statues standing watch over cities. Streets and schools bear his name. Politicians invoke him. Cultural narratives celebrate him. But with every retelling, the story brightens and smooths. The rough edges of suffering fade. The villages burned twice in 2 years become footnotes. The refugees vanish from the narrative. The soldiers who died nameless in the snow are overshadowed by the prince whose decisions shaped their fate. This is what history does, it polishes, but the reality is more powerful than the legend. Stephen was not great because he conquered. He was great because he endured. He was great because he refused to let his people be erased. He was great because, when faced with an impossible choice, he chose survival over comfort, strategy over pride, sacrifice over surrender. The true legacy of Vaslui is not glory. It is resilience. Every small nation that has resisted a larger power, every commander who has used terrain and logistics instead of brute force, every people who have fought to remain themselves in the shadow of domination. All of them walk a path Stephen once forged with fire and blood. As decades passed, the story of Vaslui transformed from a military account into a myth, not because it needed embellishment, but because its impact stretched far beyond the battlefield. It became a symbol spoken in whispers among oppressed peoples, a reminder that even the most unstoppable force can be broken under the right conditions. But for those who lived through it, the memory was not heroic. It was heavy, cold, and carved into the earth like the footprints left in the frozen valley. When Stephen died in 1504, Moldavia mourned him not as a king who had ruled comfortably from a throne, but as a guardian who had spent his life standing between his people and annihilation. Yet the memory of what they survived remained, and it influenced generations long after swords were replaced by muskets and empires shifted their borders. But before we reach that legacy, we must examine the truth behind the victory. Why Vaslui mattered, and why it still matters. For the Ottoman Empire, Vaslui was not the beginning of decline. The empire continued expanding for another century. But the battle exposed cracks in the imperial armor. It revealed vulnerabilities that European leaders would later study, analyze, and weaponize. The Ottomans learned from Vaslui, but so did everyone else. Stephen had shown that terrain beats numbers. Stephen forced a numerically superior army into a valley where they could not deploy effectively. It was not luck. It was engineering. Logistics beat bravery. The Ottomans did not lose because they lacked courage. They lost because they lacked food, warmth, and rest. Hunger is a sharper enemy than steel. Attrition beats pride. Stephen made the empire pay for every mile. Before the battle even began, they had already lost. Timing beats tradition. Winter warfare was unconventional, almost insane. But winter became Stephen's greatest ally. A motivated small force can wound a giant if it chooses the ground and method of battle. Moldavia fought not for ambition, but for survival. Desperation made them dangerous. These lessons would echo through European warfare for centuries. At Vienna in 1683, at the Pruth River in 1711, and even in the strategies employed by the Russians against Napoleon and later against Nazi Germany. The idea that the land itself is a weapon can trace part of its lineage back to Stephen's scorched earth and winter strategy. But let us return to the aftermath, because victory does not mean peace. After Vaslui, Stephen did not rest. He could not. He spent his final decades navigating the shifting sands of European politics. At times he was a celebrated hero, at other times a solitary ruler abandoned by allies he had once fought to protect. Europe loved praising him but rarely sent meaningful aid. He understood something timeless. Nations do not help you out of gratitude. They help you out of fear or interest. When those interests shifted, Stephen stood alone again. His relationships with Poland fluctuated between alliance and tension. Hungary admired him but feared his influence. Wallachia oscillated between loyalty and betrayal depending on which prince sat on its throne. The Crimean Tatars continued to raid Moldavian lands. Every time Stephen solved one crisis, another rose from a different border. And yet he endured. One of the most revealing episodes came in 1497, when the Polish king John Albert invaded Moldavia under the pretext of launching a crusade against the Ottomans. In reality, he intended to subjugate Moldavia. Stephen knew the truth, and he set another trap. The Battle of the Kosman Forest was not as famous as Vaslui, but it was cut from the same cloth. Terrain manipulation, psychological warfare, and precision ambush. The Polish army marched into dense forest, confident in their numerical strength, only to find the trees closing around them like a cage. Stephen's forces struck from all sides. Panic spread. The Polish king barely escaped. Once again, Stephen showed that numbers meant nothing without control. It is important to recognize the consistency in his victories. They were not miracles. They were not accidents. They were the product of a lifetime of studying war. Stephen was predictable only in one way. He always chose the strategy that kept Moldavia alive, no matter how costly, no matter how morally gray. But legends simplify. They sand down the edges of the man who lived through this brutality. In the centuries after his death, Stephen was canonized by the Romanian Orthodox Church. He became Saint Stephen the Great. Pilgrims visited his monastery at Putna. Songs turned him into a warrior saint chosen by God. Monuments rose. Coins bore his face. Yet sainthood hides the man who burned his own villages, the man who ordered wells poisoned, the man who hardened himself because softness meant death for thousands, the man who carried the burden of choosing who would suffer so that others might survive. This is not to diminish him, but to humanize him. Stephen's greatness came not from divine intervention, but from relentless discipline, intelligence, and will. He was a master strategist, a ruthless defender, and a visionary leader. But he was also a man shaped by impossible circumstances. His choices were not between good and bad, they were between bad and worse. And here lies the paradox. The survival of Moldavia required someone willing to commit acts that would haunt a gentler soul. Leadership in existential times is not a matter of ideals. It is a matter of endurance. The Ottomans respected Stephen, even as they sought to crush him. They recognized in him the qualities they respected in their own best generals: clarity, resolve, and unforgiving tactical insight. Foreign travelers described him as charismatic, fierce, and proud. Diplomats described him as intimidating, brilliant, and unpredictable. Peasants described him as their protector. Nobles described him as their master. Enemies described him as a nightmare who always seemed one step ahead. But every person who crossed paths with him remembered him. Even Mem too, a man who had stormed Constantinople and reshaped the world, remembered the sting of Moldavia. When the Sultan died in 1481, some chroniclers wrote that he regretted only one failure in his career: his inability to break Stephen. By the time Stephen died, Moldavia was still sovereign. The principality had endured waves of invasion, betrayal, famine, and devastation, and yet its borders still held. Its people still called it home. Its culture still thrived. This was his ultimate victory. He did not win forever. No one does. But he bought time, precious, irreplaceable, generational time. Time for Moldavia to develop, to strengthen, to survive long enough to shape the future. Not many rulers can say the same. And centuries later, when modern nations rose from the lands he once defended, they carried his memory forward. Not because he expanded territory or amassed wealth, but because he kept them alive. This is the deeper truth behind Vaslui. It was not a story about conquest. It was a story about endurance, about a people refusing to vanish, about a leader who chose the hard path every time survival demanded it. If you walk through the lands of modern Moldova or Romania today, the memory of Stephen is everywhere, in statues, in street names, in school books, in churches. But memory is selective. It chooses what to illuminate and what to leave in shadow. And nowhere is this more evident than in how the story of Vaslui has been retold across centuries. To school children, Stephen is a hero whose courage defeated a mighty empire. To nationalists, he is the founder of identity. To the church, he is a saint. To historians, he is a strategist without equal. But behind each version of him lies a truth that is rarely spoken aloud. Stephen fought because he had no other choice. The age he lived in was not kind to small nations. The great powers of the 15th century, the Ottoman Empire, Hungary, Poland, the Crimean Khanate, Venice, all moved like predators, circling, probing for weakness, ready to exploit political fractures. Moldavia lay at a crossroads of ambition. To survive at that crossroads required a ruler who understood the brutal arithmetic of power. Stephen understood it better than anyone. He knew that treaties were fragile, that alliances were temporary, that promises made by kings could be broken the moment they became inconvenient. He watched Wallachia bend under the weight of Ottoman pressure. He watched Serbia fall. He watched Bosnia crumble. He watched the Byzantines lose Constantinople, a disaster that reshaped the entire continental order. He learned that strength alone could not protect a state. What protected it was deterrence, making conquest too costly, too exhausting, too bitter to justify. This philosophy guided every choice he made at Vaslui and beyond. And yet, while these decisions ensured Moldavia survived, they also carved scars that lasted generations. Consider the young soldier who survived the Battle of Vaslui, only to return home to a village burned twice in 2 years. His father dead from winter sickness. His mother missing since the 1476 evacuation. His younger sister sold into slavery by Ottoman raiders. What did victory mean to him? What did survival mean? Or the noble whose estate was destroyed, who rebuilt using the last of his savings, who fed his retainers from dwindling stores because he believed in Stephen, only to watch the Ottomans return and burn everything again. Did he still believe afterward? Or did he resent the price he had paid for his country's freedom? Or the peasant children who spent their earliest years as refugees, sleeping in barns, surviving on handouts from monasteries, never knowing what stability felt like? Did they grow up grateful or simply hardened? History praises kings. Reality is lived by everyone else. But Stephen, unlike many rulers, carried this awareness. He did not send his people to fight while he stayed behind stone walls. He fought with them. He bled with them. He watched his own lands burn twice. He rebuilt along with his subjects. He lost friends, advisors, soldiers he had trained personally. He held the cries of the wounded. He buried the dead. He wore the weight of command like iron armor that never came off. This is why his people trusted him more than most rulers of the era. He demanded sacrifice, but he also shared in it. He did not hide. He did not run. When Moldavians suffered, so did he. And that bond between ruler and people is what made Vaslui possible. But as with all great figures, Stephen's legacy did not remain confined to his own lifetime. It grew. After his death in 1504, chronicles and poets elevated him. They crafted an image that posterity could admire, one cleansed of moral ambiguity. They turned him into a unifying symbol in an age marked by foreign domination and internal fragmentation. Centuries later, during times of national awakening, both Romanians and Moldovans embraced Stephen as proof that they had once resisted empires and could resist them again. But even as his legend grew, new debates emerged. Romania claimed him as a key founder of Romanian identity. Moldova claimed him as their ancestral ruler. Ukraine pointed to fortresses standing within their borders built under his rule. Modern borders do not resemble medieval ones. And so history becomes a contested inheritance. Each nation shapes Stephen into a figure who fits its narrative. Yet beneath the political reinterpretations lies a truth that transcends all of them. Stephen's struggle was not about nationhood in the modern sense. It was about survival, raw, immediate, desperate survival. He did not think in terms of ethnic identity. He thought in terms of borders, alliances, and the lives of those under his protection. His duty was to keep Moldavia intact, culturally, politically, spiritually, long enough for future generations to inherit it. And he succeeded. But the question remains, at what cost? Some victories are clean, glorious, and celebrated. Vaslui was not one of them. Vaslui was a victory carved out of starvation, frostbite, disease, exhaustion, and unimaginable risk. It was a victory built on the suffering of civilians forced to abandon everything. It was a victory sealed by the deaths of thousands who had never wielded power but who bore the consequences of its decisions. This is what makes Vaslui extraordinary. Not the numbers, not the tactics, not even the result, but the fact that Stephen looked at the full weight of the cost, the burning, the starvation, the evacuation, the possible annihilation of his people, and decided that paying that cost was better than losing everything. He chose the terrible path because the alternative was unthinkable. Leaders today rarely face such decisions, but when they do, history often judges them harshly. Stephen was fortunate that his gamble succeeded. If it had not, he would not be remembered as Stephen the Great. He would be remembered as Stephen the Destroyer, the ruler who burned his own kingdom and failed. Victory rewrites morality, but intent remains. Stephen intended to save his people, even if it meant hurting them to keep them alive. This is the paradox of leadership in a hostile world. Those who protect often become the ones who inflict pain. Those who save often become the ones who sacrifice. Those who win often become the ones haunted by the cost. And Stephen, for all his triumphs, was no exception. As he aged, he prayed more. He built churches and monasteries. He donated land to religious institutions. Not simply for show, not simply for the salvation of his soul, but because deep down he carried guilt, not for winning but for what winning required. Maybe this is why people still admire him centuries later. Not because he was perfect, but because he was willing to do what perfection would not allow. Vaslui teaches a lesson as relevant today as it was 550 years ago. Strength is not always the power to strike. Sometimes strength is the power to endure. Empires rise, empires fall. But the courage to resist, the courage to remain, that is the legacy Stephen left behind. Stephen's story does not end with the battles he won or the lands he protected. It ends with the idea he left behind, an idea more powerful than any fortress and more enduring than any victory. In a world shaped by conquest and collapsing kingdoms, Stephen proved something that changed how people understood power. You don't have to be the biggest force on the map to shape history. You just have to refuse to disappear. For nearly half a century, he stood against empires, kings, raiders, traitors, and fate itself. He outlasted sultans, outmaneuvered armies, and outthought rivals. He rebuilt his country after every devastation and carried his people forward when the world tried to push them into oblivion. And he did it not because he was shielded by wealth or geography, but because he understood a truth born from suffering. An empire can break your walls, but it cannot break your will unless you hand it over. When he died in 1504, Moldavia was still standing, independent, unsubjugated, scarred, yes, but alive. That alone set him apart from most rulers of his age. The chronicles praised him, his people mourned him, and centuries later, Romanians and Moldovans would both claim him as the guardian who defined their past and shaped their identity. But beyond borders, beyond politics, beyond nationality, Stephen's legacy carries a universal message. You don't need overwhelming strength to survive overwhelming odds. You need clarity, strategy, resolve, and the courage to choose the hard road when the easy one leads to ruin. Vaslui was never just a battle. It was a declaration, a small nation telling an empire, "You may crush kingdoms, but you will not erase us." And that message still resonates today, in every people who fight to remain themselves, in every nation that refuses to bow, in every leader who understands that survival sometimes demands impossible sacrifices. Stephen the Great is remembered not because he lived in an age of heroes, but because he proved that heroes rise in the darkest hours. He turned a frozen valley in 1475 into a lesson for centuries. That even giants bleed, and even the smallest spark of resistance can force the world to change course. If you've followed this story all the way here, if the courage, the sacrifice, and the strategy behind Vaslui moved you, then don't let it end on this page. Subscribe to the channel, not just to support the work, but because history told without filters, without fluff, without sugarcoating, stories of real people who shaped the world through impossible decisions. These are the stories worth keeping alive. And if Stephen's stand meant something to you, imagine what the next stories will bring. Subscribe and stay for the battles that still echo.